For one thing, before I begin, in your programs, would you please, in your mind's eye, take out the italics on the title? Because I'm not talking about the book, I'm talking about the character. So it's PUDD'NHEAD WILSON, the character, not the title. All right, so start out, some orientation. Am I hearable? Everything okay? Hear me?
Yeah.
To start out, some orientation might be helpful. I call this a transatlantic journey. We begin in Italy with Twain's writing PUDD'NHEAD WILSON. His awareness of his literary ancestor Dante had a large effect on the way he wrote his story. Then we pause while we come to America, its race law and the Supreme Court, with special attention on its two-time lone dissenter, John Marshall Harlan. Then we go back to Florence and stay there as we consider how Twain's conflicted novel, when read as a kind of a parable, portrays America's race law. Now let us begin. Writing in Florence, Mark Twain was sharply aware of his literary ancestor of 600 years, Dante Alighieri. In some ways, Twain seems to have felt as guided by Dante as Dante had been guided on his descent into hell by Virgil. Dante's allegory depicted two sides in Florence, warring against each other over power and money. The sides were known as the whites and the blacks. Indeed, it was in Florence that Mark Twain openly expressed a kinship with Dante. Twain had owned Longfellow's translation of the Divine Comedy since it was published in 1867. By the time, 25 years later, that he joined Dante in Florence, Twain was quite familiar with the Commedia, having referred to it often in his writings and his correspondence. But Twain's dark comedy of race law's descent into the ninth circle of hell was unlike Dante's more hopeful Inferno. Having no ascent back into the shining world again in his story, prompted Twain to whisper an alert to the reader with a hint about how to read his fiction about white America's fiction of race law. Twain could see many parallels between himself and his guide. For starters, Dante's La Commedia was not about ancient times in Italy. It was written about the Florence of Dante's own time, its graft, its political corruption, its internecine warfare. There was murder and pillage. The blacks and the whites fought each other in the streets. And there's another parallel, the fact that the Commedia is a comedy, mocking human error. A comedy, but darkly so. Twain surely saw Dante as a guide for his own mockery of America's race law, whites fighting against justice for blacks. And then this, very valuably for my vision of Twain's narrative, keeping in mind that La Commedia is an allegory, a sort of parable, lends possibilities for us to see the underlying coherence in Twain's dark Commedia. Meanwhile, in my transatlantic approach, back in America in 1883, the United States Supreme Court had taken up the civil rights cases. 5 litigations from various states across the country, all of them concerning state laws regarding race, and the court had bundled them together to adjudicate as one. Acting alone in the judgment was Justice John Marshall Harlan from Kentucky, a former slave owner, appointed to the court in 1877. Harlan had been a colonel commanding a Union infantry in the Civil War, but he had been critical of the Emancipation Proclamation and had opposed Lincoln's re-election in 1864. After the war, he attacked the 13th Amendment. His lifespan, 1833 to 1911, was almost identical to Clemens's. Just about the same year that Clemens was becoming the Mark Twain we know under the influence of the progressive Langdon family in Elmira, in 1871, Harlan also experienced a spectacular reversal in his beliefs by abruptly supporting the Civil Rights Amendments and publicly renouncing his former views. He transformed himself from his upbringing in a slave-owning culture to becoming a strong proponent of the Union and defender of equal justice for all. In the civil rights cases, Harlan had written a passionate 30-page dissent. It resolutely evoked stare decisis, let the decision stand, in its use of 25 previous cases that Harlan amassed to prove by law the majority's error in judgment, and to persuade his fellow justices, all but one of them from the North or the West, to see the light. By contrast, Harlan, again the lone dissenter 13 years later in Plessy v. Ferguson, with a court very similar in makeup to the previous one, wrote a dissent that was less than half as long and with fewer than half as many precedents. In it, he rebuked the majority's decision with almost Twain-like sarcasm and ironic hyperbole, rhetoric rarely seen in judicial writing. Quote, "If a state can prescribe that whites and blacks shall not travel in the same coach, why may it not so regulate the use of the streets of cities as to compel white citizens to keep to one side of the street and black citizens on the other? Why may not the state require the separation of native and naturalized citizens, or of Protestants or Catholics? Our Constitution is colorblind," Harlan famously proclaimed, "and neither knows or tolerates classes among its citizens. In my opinion," he powerfully concluded, "the judgment this day rendered will, in time, prove to be quite as pernicious as the decision made by this tribunal in the Dred Scott case, the case that was then and has ever since been considered the worst Supreme Court decision ever." It seems clear what has happened. Harlan has given up on his time. In his dissent, this time less legalistic, more philosophical, he is writing to the future, in time, to use his term, when this judgment will be overturned by a right-minded court. Back across the sea in Florence, Mark Twain was operating under a similar conviction. In Huckleberry Finn, the second of Twain's trilogy of American novels, American race law had been depicted with sharp criticism through the voice of Huckleberry Finn. At the end, Huck decides not to go back to civilization. "I've been there before," he says. Like Harlan in the 1883 civil rights cases, Twain in his 1885 Huckleberry Finn had given up on his time. PUDD'NHEAD WILSON shows more growth by Twain than any of his other works. In it, this was the third of his American trilogy. In it, he tells a woeful tale set before the Civil War and told to a late century audience that was still firmly stuck in pre-war time in its attitude toward race law. Scholars have noted a sharp shift from Huckleberry Finn to Pudd'nhead Wilson and have sought to account for it with a fresh way of reading Pudd'nhead Wilson, ways that overcome the narrative's logical contradictions. A few examples provide sufficient evidence. Andrew Hoffman, time and again, gets close, only to back off and betray his own ambition. Identifying David Wilson as a prototype of a modern hero, an existential hero, Hoffman names him. Hoffman says this: "We cannot deny that Wilson is the hero of the book." At that, I just say, oh my. Oh yes, we can deny that. There is no hero here, existential or otherwise. And then there's John Carlos Rowe, laboring diligently to find a way around the tale's dissonance, his favorite term. For a conclusion, Rowe declares his greatest insight. His ending should have been his beginning, for it's there that he asserts that the narrative, quote, achieves its greatness by virtue of its refusal to resolve its issues, unquote. That's good. There's potential there. But all Rowe means by unresolved issues is the, quote, tension between the sentimental romance and the irony of the aphorisms, unquote. Telling us what the narrative doesn't do doesn't meet the difficulty, to use Harlan's curt comment in the Plessy opinion. Tell us what it does do, what to make of this account that refuses to resolve its issues. This brings us to James Cox and his famous, well-titled The Fate of Humor. In his chapter on Pudd'nhead Wilson, Cox astutely identifies one problem, he calls them, after another. David Wilson is an ironic stranger. The story is repressive, not liberative. Wilson's objective with new forensic evidence is to restore the status quo. None of the characters is fully realized, their emblems, their stick figures. For Cox and everyone, these amount to problems, because the readers approach this chronicle, as Cox carefully calls this novel, with the usual expectations about how fiction by Twain is written and how it is to be read. Unlike an allegory, such as Dante's Commedia, Pudd'nhead Wilson may be more like a parable, not lighthearted, but a simple story that teaches a moral lesson, albeit regressive, not liberative. It reflects to an astonishing degree the false, dark, sightless view in the Plessy decision, as the majority strove to retain through law the white supremacy of pre-Civil War America. In brief form, here's a rendering of Twain's bitter depiction of American race law still prevailing at the end of the 19th century. This is a narrative lying almost hidden beneath the welter of distractions and duplications that truthfully, though distractingly, capture the confusion about race conditions in 19th century America. Let's title this The Parable of Pudd'nhead Wilson, the Character, an American Comedy from Hell. Once upon a time in America, back in 1830, when our grandparents were very young, there was a little southern town on a big river. Some of the inhabitants were white-skinned and called themselves FFVs. They were proud of their long family heritages and age-old customs, going back to a time before the country became America. One of these was the town's leading citizen, a judge. He was 40 years old, He had been born the same year America had been born. His white skin privilege was part of America's foundation. Other inhabitants in the town were black-skinned. The white skins called themselves masters and told stories about how superior to the black skins they were. They called the black skins slaves. A few times, new laws were made to change the status quo and make black skins and white skins equal. To keep themselves in power, the white skins translated the new laws in ways to maintain the old customs. Established usages is what they called them, against the black skins. Sometimes the slaves stole trinkets or coins from their masters. The masters got very angry and threatened the slaves. The blacks cowered while thinking that these small things were nothing compared to what the whites had stolen from them, their liberty. Some white men forced black women to have babies with them. The baby did not have black skin, but the whites called the baby black anyway and made it a slave. Roxy, a white-skinned black woman, had a baby boy this way. On the same day, a white woman had a baby boy. Roxy's boy was named Chambers. The white boy was named Tom. The white mother died and Roxy cared for both boys. They looked alike, so Roxy switched them to free her son from the laws of slavery. She became her son's slave. As soon as he became white-skinned, Tom began to be a bad baby. As he grew older, he got meaner. He hit his mother and stabbed Chambers. The laws allowed this. Roxy and Chambers were slaves. Tom was their master. One day, a man moved into this little town. His name was David Wilson. He was white and a lawyer. He came from a long way away in the northern part of America. His attitudes and sense of humor were different. The other whites thought he was odd. He liked to write little short sayings on his calendar. One was, "Training is everything." He also kept track of the fingerprints of everyone, black-skinned and white-skinned. The whites thought he was a fool. They laughed at him and called him Pudd'nhead. He stayed in the little town anyway. Later, when Roxy was freed in 1845 and decided to leave the little town, Wilson asked her if she would like copies of her boy's fingerprints as a memento. Roxy said no. She's superstitious, Wilson thought to himself. That's the black blood in her. By 1853, when he was 23 and heir to the judge's fortune, Tom had become very dishonest and physically brutal. He stole and was deeply in debt from gambling. He murdered the judge. The whites were shocked that the murderer was white-skinned. But the lawyer, Wilson, used fingerprints to show that Tom was actually black. The people cheered and praised David Wilson. They elected him mayor. Training was everything. The lawyer had seen to it that justice prevailed. The established usages from the beginning of the country, even before our grandparents were born, had been preserved. The status quo remained, and everyone lived happily ever after. As Mark Twain's biographer, Albert Bigelow Paine, has recorded, a fortune teller once told Twain that he was missing his calling. "You should be a lawyer. That's where your talents lie." Twain listened, though he found his own way. Reading Twain's race law novel in this simplified form, like a parable, makes clearer why it has no authorial voice, no huckleberry fib, only a hollowness, a silence, letting the befouled status quo remain at the cynically humorous, stunningly abrupt ending. Twain appears in it only by implication, through the scorn and contempt, as Cox has put it, that this parable embodies. Like Harlan's dissent in Plessy, in Pudd'nhead Wilson, Twain has also given up on his time regarding race law in America. He too is writing for the future. So resolute is he that there isn't even a detached comment by Twain, equivalent to Harlan's dissent, which independently followed the majority opinion in Plessy. Unless Twain's dissent is his whisper. It is his whisper when he told us of his newly felt literary heritage with Dante, whose allegory mocks the corruption and injustice of his time. That heritage was much older and was honorable, unlike the humiliating, decayed FFV in America, still pushing in the late 19th century and after to keep the old customs and laws in place. Twain and Harlan both wrote for the future of race law in America. Literary history shows that Twain would not have to wait long. As this parable teaches, and as Twain's chronicle proves, when it comes to law and literature, in their treatments of racial justice in America, law languishes far behind literature. Thank you.